Hi, this is Harmony Packer with Healthier You Counseling in Linden, Utah. I'm here with another message for missionaries and early return missionaries. I thought for a minute it might be helpful to talk today about grief and loss. You may be a missionary who's still out in the field under quarantine, and you may be suffering some loss of your normal activities and what you went on a mission to accomplish. You may be a missionary who's come home and been released, and you may be feeling grief and loss under those circumstances, unexpected grief and loss. You may be an early returned missionary. You may be a missionary who has returned home and is expecting to get reassigned, but you're in between right now in what some are calling your intermission. You may have experienced loss right now in terms of changes in your identity and roles, or in your purpose and meaning as a missionary, or as a released missionary, in your relationships, in your opportunities for experiences and growth, in your perspective, or in your routine and structure. And perhaps there's other ways that you have experienced loss or are experiencing loss right now. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross developed a model back in the late 60s or early 70s that she called the stages of grief model. She initially started with 5 stages of grief, and it's been expanded to 7 now. Those stages are shock at hearing the bad news or recognizing the loss, denial of the loss, anger, or other strong emotions associated with the loss, bargaining, looking for a way out of the situation, depression, testing or looking for solutions, and finally acceptance. And it's important to recognize that acceptance is not being okay with the situation as much as it is finding a way forward in the situation. Now, that list of stages of grief looks really linear, but grief isn't linear. Grief is more like this, this image. We want grief to be a starting point and an ending point, and we want to know when the ending point is, but grief is actually much more complicated than that. Those steps or stages of grief can be experienced in any order, and you may go back and forth between those steps and stages of grief in your experience. There are some other characteristics that are common to grief. One is that there is no timeline. You may experience grief for a month and then feel like you've moved past it, or it may take a year or more. Grief is personal to the individual experiencing it. Even someone who is suffering the same loss will probably have a different experience with the grief that they feel towards that loss. And then there are usually physical effects to grief. Those physical effects could include tears, fatigue, depression, even a reduced immune response in your body. Those stages of grief are one way to think of grief, and you may recognize yourself in some of those stages. Another way to think about grief that may apply to your situation right now is a concept of grief called ambiguous grief, which was developed by Pauline Boss. Ambiguous loss is a loss that occurs without closure or understanding. It may even feel senseless, and you may wonder why it happened. Ambiguous grief leaves you confused or looking for answers. Ambiguous grief can complicate or delay the process of grieving because it hasn't been resolved. There has been no closure, and perhaps you're still in the middle of the loss. Ambiguous grief can result in unresolved grief. Ambiguous loss can result in unresolved grief, in feeling frozen or in limbo. If you have come home from your mission and are expecting to be reassigned, for example, you may feel like you're in limbo. If you're in quarantine, you may feel like you're in limbo. If you've been released from your mission and you don't know what's next in your life, or you don't know where or when you'll move on to the next step, you may feel like you're in limbo. Some other characteristics of ambiguous loss: you may be on a roller coaster of emotions. That's completely normal. There are a lack of rituals with ambiguous loss. For example, if you have returned home, You may not have had the typical airport greeting from your family and friends that you expected to have or that you anticipated when you returned home from your mission. You may not have given a homecoming talk in church or reported to the High Council. The balloons and banners and excitement and celebration of your return may not have happened like you expected, and those lack of rituals are often part of ambiguous loss. With ambiguous loss, others may not recognize or understand your loss. They haven't been where you've been, they haven't experienced things the way you've experienced them, and they may not recognize how much it is affecting you. And then there may be stigma or judgment from within the culture about your loss. Often missionaries who return home early for any reason feel judged or feel stigma for not completing their mission, for not having the typical mission experience. So here are some tasks and tips for managing your losses. First, recognize and validate your losses. Write down what has changed in your life and what you're missing. Cherish the positive memories, but recognize that there are things that you won't get to experience again. One example of this, my family has moved often, and my husband and I have a practice of, after we've moved, making just a short list of 5 things that we miss the most from the place that we moved from, and also 5 things that we won't miss from the place that we've moved from. Another tip for managing your losses is to make meaning of your losses. You can create your own rituals. You may not be able to have the typical rituals, but you can create your own rituals to mark the ending of the experience that you are having or that you had, even if it's not the way you wanted or expected the ending to be. You can tell your story. Tell the story of your mission, of how it ended or of how it's gone so far. Reframe and redefine your expectations, your goals, your purpose, and your identity. Those things are things that are changing, in the process of changing. It can be meaningful, or you can create meaning by redefining or reframing what those are and taking stock of where you are and where you want to go. Third, acceptance and resilience. Being okay with uncertainty, with imperfection, with unmet expectations, and learning to live with and adapt with changes is an important thing to do in this situation. Some missionaries do think of this time as an intermission, and that helps them define or accept the situation that they're in. Others, you may want to think of the situation that you're in as another transfer. Perhaps you haven't even moved. Perhaps you are still in your apartment where you were when the quarantine started, but perhaps you can think of your new situation as a new transfer. If you've transferred before on your mission, you're used to making those changes and adapting to a new situation, a new location, new people. These are new circumstances that you're in now. One way to find acceptance and to develop resilience is to think of that as a transfer, just another transfer to adapt to. Another idea for or tip for finding acceptance and resilience is to identify what you can and can't control. There's a lot that you can't control right now. Identifying what those things are and recognizing that there is no control, and then also recognizing what you do have control over can empower you and help you to find acceptance and resilience in this situation. Lastly, self-care and self-compassion. These are important tips or skills for dealing with uncertainty, with ambiguous loss. Self-care and self-compassion can include rest. It can include recreation and humor. It can include accepting help from others. It can include recognizing that it's okay to feel what you feel and to grieve the losses that you've experienced. It can look like finding support or taking refuge in community, and that community may be your family if you're home with your family, or if you're able to communicate with them, or it may be finding community and support in your in your fellow missionaries who are in the same boat that you're in. Finally, self-care and compassion can be letting go of guilt and shame and blame for a situation that you don't have any control over. So whatever circumstances you're in, whether you've returned home and been released, whether you've returned home and you're expecting to be reassigned, whether you're still on your mission and you're in quarantine, whatever situation you're in, know that the Lord is watching over you and He will help you to manage the feelings of grief and the experience of loss that you may be feeling right now, and seek His help in those things. Thanks. Talk to you next week.